with us, Umar. Bring in Dr. Al-Aridi. Let's get your comments on this. President Bashar al-Assad recently, in a statement, said that he is looking forward to the 2021 elections, the democratic elections, and that anybody would be able to contest them, that there would be, of course, more parties participating as compared to last time. What are your sentiments on this statement he gave recently?
Well, the goal of such statements by Assad are twofold. One, it is occasioned with the convening of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva, which is supposed to write a new constitution for Syria. And he is just in such statements trying to block the work and the activity of that committee by just bringing in the elections, which cannot happen in any way these days. There is no neutral environment, there is no objective one, there is no safe one, and no one can go to elections as such. Another thing is that when he talks about elections and when he talks about detaching himself from any results that could come out of the work of this Constitution Committee, actually he is addressing basically those loyal to him that he's all right, everything is fine. That is said actually by him after half of the population is displaced, 1 million people were killed. We have around 10 million people out of the country or scattered in the country without shelter. And now, talking about elections, talking about these things, as I said, is addressed to his loyals, but it is illogical and it is hindering. And it is actually against what Russia, which is the main party responsible for his continuity, is blocking what Russia is trying to do, trying to get a political settlement, achieve a political settlement after 4 years of military action, which is something that's needed to be presented to the world, that Russia is in for achieving a political settlement, not only for military purposes, for killing, for destruction. Now, whenever there is a political event, try to remember Geneva and the different rounds in Geneva, it is usually occasioned and timed with a certain terrorist act carried out by the militias that Assad and his regime brought in order to protect them, the Hezbollah militia, the Iranians, even the Russian intervention. It is occasioned with this military act in order to divert attention from any political process which he and his regime rejected, obstructed, and hindered from the very beginning.
And that's something that Umar also pointed out here, the eastern part of Syria, where about 300,000 Kurds are at the risk of being displaced, where the Turkish troops have essentially established control of this 120-kilometer strip, including Tal Abyad and Ras Al Ain. There is a deep concern from various reports we're learning that of civilians of the Syrian regime coming back. So there is a big question on what will happen to the autonomy of that region.
People actually are between not only one rock, but many rocks and in many hard places. You have the intervention of the Turks, the Americans are there, the Russians are coming in, the regime, and also the National Syrian Free Army. All those are in a state of conflict, but there are agreements between the Astana partners, in particular Turkey and Russia, something that would tranquilize that area, and at the same time get rid of the Qasad, the democratic Kurd forces, which are labeled and treated by Turkey as a threat to Turkey's national security, and at the same time a threat to the indigenous population, where they displaced many people and they created some demographic changes. And now the accord between Russia and Turkey and the talk between the Americans and the Turks hopefully would lead to some sort of settlement over there that could bring the people who were displaced, that could push the federal, the democratic Kurdish forces down into the area, and they are trying to flirt the regime. So whoever has power, they are trying to attach themselves to. And you remember that relationship that they had with the Turks, with the Americans at a certain time, and now the Americans announced that they would be leaving.
Right.
Later on, they decided that they would keep some forces for the oil fields, and those oil fields actually were exploited by the regime, by Daesh, by the Kurds, by the Qasad people. Right. And now what needs to be done is people deciding themselves what they need, not to be taken hostages by any other forces.
At the moment, Syria is like the free-for-all situation where every party that is involved there seems to be looking after their interests. Here in Turkey, with their offensive, Umar, now reaching almost a month in northeastern Syria, there's still a very uneasy truce prevails. Like you mentioned, the situation was very volatile, but there's a big concern also about the ISIS prisoners there. There are over 1,000. There are thousands of prisoners that are right now being watched by the SDF. Now, when Turkey is trying to repatriate some of these foreign fighters, there is a lot of resistance, especially from the UK, from the Netherlands, that have stripped them of their citizenship. Is this going to be the last sort of stumbling block, or do you feel that maybe at Washington this is going to finally be addressed?
I think Washington has tried as much as it can to sort of pressure these governments to take its citizens back. And in that sense, Donald Trump was partially right when he said that we can't keep waiting for these governments to take their people back, and we can't keep troops there to guard these people. These are the responsibilities of these European governments. So that's sort of ongoing, and that's it's like a very sad situation. There's actually 70 or 80,000 people that are involved here. Most of them are women and children and families of people. And then you have about 10,000 people that can be considered combatants. And out of those, you have about 1,000 people who are nationals of Western countries, of European countries, of North America, of Australia. So those people are sort of the big hot potatoes. What are you going to do with those people? The problem always sort of was that the SDF had control of these people. They had them under detention in northeastern Syria, but a lot of these governments didn't see the SDF as another legitimate state, so they didn't want to send their consular personnel there to process these people. They didn't want to talk to them in terms of setting up sort of an international criminal tribunal for these people. ISIS was sort of the worst of the worst that the world has seen in the last few years. So I guess in public minds in Europe, a lot of sympathy is gone for these people. But it's a real problem that we have to deal with in this region now.
But is there any clarity, Umar, what would happen to those who have been stripped of their citizenship by the UK, by Netherlands? If they are not going to be taken back, what is their future then?
Right now they're stuck where they are. So some of them are stuck in Syria, in SDF controlled camps. We have people like Shamima Begum, a British citizen. We have in Turkey, we have in prisons, we have an Australian citizen here, for example, Neil Prakash, who had his citizenship stripped by the Australians. When people remove sort of citizenship from someone, they always say that, this individual can get citizenship in a second country because of their ethnic background. But in all of these cases, we've seen that those other countries that they supposedly have links to have refused to acknowledge that. So these people for now are just stuck where they are. So there are talks going on, especially in the last few weeks since the Turkish operation in Syria, talks between European governments about what to do with people. But we see sort of the practice of stripping people of citizenship continuing. Just a few weeks ago, two Dutch citizens who escaped from an SDF-controlled detention camp in Syria made it all the way to Ankara in Turkey, and they went to the Dutch embassy, and they were hoping that would start the process of them being sent home. but actually the Dutch stripped one of the women of their citizenship, and so now she's stuck in Turkey, and the other woman was extradited or will be extradited in the next few days. So this is sort of an ongoing problem.
And an uneasy problem is it really puts into question what would happen if they've already seen the withdrawal of their biggest ally, the US, the SDF. How long are they going to keep an eye on these Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Daesh prisoners in northeast Syria, where already infrastructure is crumbling? Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, with the kind of entanglement of regional players in northeast Syria, how would this affect the fate of these prisoners, affect the overall sort of peace and calm in the region of what one can expect in the future?
Well, as Omar said, that area is torn between different forces, and now this problem of Daesh that was with us for about 4 or 5 years, and now the remainings of those people who were detained by the SDF, and the threat that SDF would release some of them who are still in jail, also would create a more complicated problem for the region. That's one. Another thing also for the indigenous population over there, it is them who should decide their own destiny if there is will on the part of the United States, Turkey, and Russia, and at the same time the regime. But the regime is just trying to explode this whole thing of that area being fragmented, that area being torn up to promote, to further its own goals there. That's originally, that's from the very beginning. It just followed this strategy, and it's still doing the same thing. That region requires really some sort of a consensus on the part of the international community, something in the Security Council, a certain resolution that would settle this critical and sensitive region, which also contains the main economic resources of Syria in terms of water, in terms of oil, gas, and agriculture over there. And that needs to be settled with the different clashing interests of all those parties. I don't see it to be coming to any settlement, to any quietness, or to any or not taking care of any of the interests of the people there.
Well, essentially, Dr. Al-Aridi, wouldn't it be that the Turkish forces, the Russians, the Syrian regime would have to all be at some point on the same page? And with this meeting coming up in Washington, D.C. with President Trump, could there be possibly any hope that their presence, the U.S. troops there in eastern Syria, that could finally be resolved?
Well, the last thing all those parties would think of are Syrian citizens, unfortunately. What their main concern was their own interests, and each one of the parties is in a certain clash with the other. The United States doesn't feel comfortable with the Russians, and likewise the Russians. The Turkey tries very hard to protect its national security, and sometimes it's in good terms with the United States, sometimes, and most of the time it's in good terms with the Russians, and also most of the time Turkey is torn between the United States and Russia, and with the regime being that bug out there which is waiting for the clashes of interests in order to penetrate into that area, because Assad was promised that he would have control over the geography in order to get some sort of legitimacy, and in reality no legitimacy whatsoever. The regime is protected by the Russians, by the Iranians, but it plays at the expense of the disturbance, the clash of interests, and at the same time of the plight of the people is the one that promotes the regime's continuity or staying in power. Now, as I said, there must be some sort of international consensus, so there should be a settlement in that critical and sensitive region.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Al-Aridi and Mr. Umar Farooq. Thank you for joining us, giving us your insight and